Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the resignation of Justin Trudeau, the taming, or is it the triumph of right-wing populism, and the return of the grooming gangs scandal. I'm joined by Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So, Ashley, I think you're coming to us from the blessed country, or as Trump would say, state of Canada, where Justin Trudeau has announced his resignation. This seems to be one of the most immediate and significant geopolitical effects of Trump's election victory. In my understanding, Trudeau's resignation, though it reflects long-standing, simmering dissatisfaction with his rule, was triggered by Trump's tariff threats directed at Canada, along with some of his kind of big brother condescending rhetoric. And it seems that Trudeau did not respond to that ably enough, and now he is out. What's really going on?
Yeah, I mean, he was sort of dragged, it seems, kicking and screaming to this after after actually a very long stint of low popularity, and his party is sort of looking at him with doubt about how he's going to face up against Trump. And I do wonder if part of what's going on generally in the world is this. We saw years of lawfare and attempts to do absolutely everything to avoid Donald Trump coming into power. But now that he is coming into power, it almost is starting to look like an opportunity. And so what you need, it seems to me, at least looking at how people have been dealing with Trump and the sorts of visits to Trump, everyone from Zuckerberg to Maloney, to kind of trying to gain favor with Trump through, sort of these normalizing meetings, famously, obviously, Notre Dame in France and so on. Is this is sort of everyone sort of shuffling to try and find a way to get what they want from Trump? How can we use this situation? I think this is really a scary situation. I think Trudeau's resignation marks the end of a politics defined by the aesthetics of leadership. That kind of like slick PR savvy showmanship where you can say whatever or you can do whatever you want as long as you package it as inoffensively as possible. And this is really starting to turn, and I think those in power are realizing this. But it doesn't mark the beginning of the rise of the substance of leadership. In fact, what we're probably going to see is a triumph of leaders who reject both the aesthetic and the substance of leadership. And probably it seems to me that there's a lot of kind of whispering in Trump's ear, where what leaders could not do for such a long time, things that were too crazy or that had to be, even inoffensive packaging couldn't save these policies. You could kind of go to Trump and say, leaders before you didn't have the bravery and the courage to do what's necessary. And I think this is probably what's going on in Canada. Can we reshuffle and find a leader who is capable of packaging what might be some of the most offensive policies that probably neoliberal leadership has wanted for a long time, but couldn't possibly get away with? Now maybe they can get away with it. And the Trudeaus of the world can wash their hands of responsibility. So I don't think it's just about, if you talk to Canadians, I just left Canada actually yesterday. If you talk to Canadians, they're saying, oh, well, it was just because Trump was so unpopular. But I don't think so. I don't think that's really what was going on. I think it's about trying to find a leader that can match Trump's energy, but be the type of person that can package policies that are really distasteful that would be very, very difficult to sell, but now they can be sold as a kind of savvy leadership dealing with Trump on his own terms, this sort of thing. Um, Maybe we're seeing the death of this left wing aesthetic, but we're going to get the same kind of politics nonetheless, but through a harsher language. And so, we're basically trading neoliberalism with a human face for neoliberalism that's just as mean as it is. And in a sense, it's better because at least you know what you're getting. But because it's positioned as this takedown of the left, and Trudeau seems to be resigning with his tail between his legs and so on, and neoliberalism has for so long stood in for the left, it's got, this sort of populist right has such a countercultural flavor that there's absolutely nothing left to oppose any of the policies that might come up, that might now come into this vacuum. And that's a really terrifying place to be in. Who's really going to be able to, in a principled way, stand up to some of the really foolish and crazy, or maybe not even foolish, but these attempts to kind of gain hold of resources, famously like Greenland and all these sorts of things. Is this even a serious proposal? I don't know. People are starting to talk about it. This is how politics works now. It starts out as a joke and then it becomes serious. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Oh, but maybe I'm serious. You know, it's like what the neoliberals used to do by slow dripping. Leaks. They'd be like, oh, we leaked this information about new COVID plans. They leaked. Somebody, I don't know who it was. Yeah, what do you think about that? Yeah, just test the waters, and then they would actually do it, or they would do some variation of it. It's almost like Trump. The right does this sort of slow drip of the truth by first I'm just kind of joking, and just kidding, and just kidding. Okay, but now I'm serious. But who's around to reject this? There's no opposition anymore. It's just everybody, seeing this opportunity and going for it. Wow, what a state for politics to be in.
Yeah, it's striking. Trump does seem to be serious about wanting to annex Greenland. He does seem to want uh, Canada as well. And I think it's worth noting what a long-standing ambition this is for American statesmen. I think one that is very much set aside in the for large parts of the 20th century, but in the early days of the Republic, hopes were very high in the Revolutionary era that Canada would be brought into the Empire of Liberty, as Jefferson called it, and during the War of 1812, again, uh, America had very heady dreams of annexing that territory. So it's funny to see this. Trump has also announced that henceforth the Gulf of Mexico will be called the Gulf of America. I'm not sure how he'll affect that transition, but he's making the Monroe Doctrine great again. He's seems to be making a kind of manifest destiny or North American expansionism great again. I think Mexico's borders are safe for the time being, but it's quite something.
And of course, it's not Trump doing this, right? I doubt he even knew any of this stuff. It's guaranteed he didn't know a darn thing about any of this. It's like policies that have been on the table for a long time that nobody in their craziest fever dreams would put forward realistically, right? That, you'd have like maybe conversations at some summit, with some drinks and saying, what we really need to do is annex Canada. But, and now it's like, oh, they'll do it, because they can. Now it's an opportunity. And I think, what you can do is you can get all this done and wash your hands of it. Oh, that's just Trump. He's just completely crazy, isn't he? Isn't that just something Trump would do? But this is something that they've wanted for a long time. So you get the fever dreams of some, God knows, Chicago school economist or something whispering in the ear of Trump. And then it comes to fruition.
Oh, I am more inclined to credit Trump with some agency in this, but I guess one or the deeper question I think it raises is what is the basis or nature of Canada's identity at this moment as Trudeau resigns? I mean, what distinguishes it from the United States, other than what I think Trump called the imaginary line separating them?
So I would note we published a piece that touched on this some months ago by George Dunn about the Canadian philosopher George Grant, who in the 1960s published a book called Lament for a Nation that essentially announced the end of Canada as as an independent nation and its de facto subjugation to the United States, specifically in that context through its subordination to U.S. sort of Cold War defense policies and its reliance on the American security umbrella and integration into American sort of global empire. And so, there is sort of a question, I suppose, just here of, this is very fascinating in all sorts of ways that have been touched upon already. Trump, on one hand, is the candidate who ostensibly represents a kind of reversion to concerns about sovereignty, about citizenship, about borders, and thus a sort of a questioning of the sort of post-Cold War U.S. global imperium model, which called all those things into question, and through policies like NAFTA, really created new ways of sort of organizing the economic system that essentially, downgraded the importance of national borders and in many ways subordinated national sovereignty to these kind of transnational structures. And versions of this happened all over the world. We've written or we've published numerous things that cover different aspects of this in Europe and elsewhere. And so this does really get us to some very fundamental issues that have to do with the global order that was established in the post-Cold War moment, whereby, again, the kind of ostensibly benevolent reign of American power was expanded, potentially to achieve a kind of supremacy over the world. And for a place like Canada, this was kind of already, which was already sort of integrated into the American imperium, really by the 1960s, as Grant wrote about. This was, and with NAFTA, representing the next phase of that. So there is a kind of question of what the future of sovereignty is, and I think that's just a really fascinating issue because, on one hand, Trump is, at least for the American. I mean, it's a it's a fundamentally contradictory project on some level. If you're on one hand, the figure who is kind of reasserting borders and sovereignty, while on the other hand, a figure who is coming in to call into question the sort of arbitrariness of existing borders, and to sort of wonder whether whether these borders make sense or should be abolished or opened up. and so I think what I would say here is that there are a lot of ambiguities to the Trumpian project that I've written about in the Substack, in a series of posts that kind of reflect on different aspects of this. Another case that I think is kind of interesting is Ireland, which Chris Caldwell wrote about for us, which is, one of these kind of exemplary nations of this kind of post-sovereignty world, right, where it really just recreated itself as a sort of clearinghouse of global capital, and essentially, surrendered its sovereignty in all sorts of ways and became very wealthy in doing so. And so I think, and that there are certainly people within the Trumpian camp who actually very much admire that kind of model. And then on the other hand, there are people within the Trumpian camp for whom that is, that is anathema, and is precisely what needs to be dismantled. And so I think as we see all of these post-Cold War arrangements that had come into crisis in all sorts of ways, being questioned. That we can really see this going in radically different directions, and within the same political factions, you can really see the the possibilities that that come out of this kind of opening up and kind of breaking up of the structures that existed for the past 30 years,
I want to
potentially pushing us in very contradictory directions. So that's all I will
and I
say.
think, Geoff, that gets us into the next topic we want to discuss, and it's simply this: there are two completely opposed accounts, or at least seemingly opposed accounts, of the political moment we're in. One is that we're witnessing the true triumph of right-wing populism, expressed above all in Trump's election, but also in other things like the seeming discrediting of the Labour government in the UK, or perhaps Trudeau's fall. In Austria, a new government is on the cusp of being formed with the so-called far-right party. Maloney is the winner of various awards from kind of NATO, Atlantic Council type organizations. Of course, she comes out of the post-fascist political stream in Italy. So by one telling, we're in this moment of great triumph for right-wing populism. On the other, you could say that we're maybe seeing the taming of right-wing populism. One example of that would be some of the debates you've talked about in your Substack that we've covered in Compact. Otherwise, Elon Musk saying, "Good job electing this anti-immigration candidate. Now we need to turn high-skilled immigration up to 11." That's what Trump's victory means. That's what MAGA means. It means adopting Ireland as our ideal, where it's a low tax zone, and it seeks to be the preferred home of these global corporations. So, just a very direct question: which is it?
So as I was explaining before, I feel like Trump is a golden opportunity. He can do what needs to be done. And that means that I think what Trudeau's resignation in the face of Trump really illustrates is that no matter who you vote for, no matter who you get out of office, you're going to wind up more often than not with the same politics, right? And you saw this with Maloney in Italy as well, where you've got all this populism, all this work, talking to the working class, talking to everyday people's grievances and annoyances, and then you'd be on the phone to the EU saying, "Oh, don't worry, I'm going to toe the line. Oh, don't worry, I'll follow the same policies that we've always followed." And then you go back to the people and you say something about gay marriage and lesbian parents, and that's how you kind of do it. And Trump's done the same thing, where what he's done is he's given working class grievances that otherwise didn't have any mouthpiece. He's given them the Trump brand. But that's all it was a kind of branding. Because, we just had an article about this on Monday, the 6th of January, on the revenge of the neoliberals. And I thought that was really illuminating because basically, through Trump's kind of appointments really showed that he is quite just as happy as his predecessors to hand over politics, to hand over the task of governance to supranational bodies, to the neoliberal status quo. His appointment of, his embrace of big tech and things like H-1B visas, which are very contra to working class, the desires and needs of the working class that he was branding. And his appointment of conventional Wall Street figures, all of these sorts of things, just says like, this is, I'm going to do the status quo, but I'm also going to do, what the most extreme things that economists, that economists never had the courage to even propose. That's what's going to happen. And is it the taming of right-wing populism? Or is it showing right-wing populism for what it was, which was a branding of working class grievance, a performance of a counterculture, when at the end of the day, you're going to get the same old neoliberal politics, except without the human face, without the appearance of kindliness, and in a more extreme guise. It reminds me of like when in the UK, when Labour was in opposition, the only thing they ever said was, it doesn't go far enough. It should have happened sooner. So I was like, okay, well, vote Labour and you'll get the Tories faster and sooner. Oh, that's great. And maybe a bit meaner. No, sorry, maybe a bit nicer. You just got the same thing, but mean. They would get in these arguments about language. That's kind of where we are now. And it's so depressing. How can it's like, it seems like a contradiction. You get an extreme form of the status quo. That's what it's culminated in.
Geoff, your answer: triumph or taming?
Well, I want to introduce a bit of other terminology here from the political theorist Paul Piccone, who was one of the most prescient commentators on right-wing populism going back to, Italian-American Marxist sort of critical theory figure who, back in the 1980s became very interested in the rising right-wing populism, whether the Lega Nord in Italy or Le Pen, and the late Le Pen just deceased in France. Anyway, his terminology coming out of thinking about what happened in the 1960s was this notion of artificial negativity. And, essentially that without getting into too much detail, he argued essentially that, the sort of capitalist world system will produce these contradictions that it can't resolve. And so it will generate these forms of negativity, of negation that, the function of which is simply to, terminate the form of the crisis that prevails at a given moment. And they will seem, potentially like revolutionary forces and might be taken as such. But, what they really do is kind of help the system work through a phase of the crisis and thus arrive at a new configuration. So, perhaps what we're asking about right-wing populism is whether it ends up being a means by which a system that has come into crisis, and I'm sort of trying to interpret how I understand Ashley's argument, but she can correct me if I'm wrong here, has sort of generated the seeming externality or this seeming external antagonistic force that, in fact, kind of helps it resolve its own crises and, in a sense, accelerate into the next dispensation, which will itself be crisis ridden, but will, essentially overcome the crises of the prior arrangements and allow a new set of arrangements to come into place. And so, I think, and I don't want to conclude anything decisively. I don't think, and let me just try to answer the question more directly now, that I don't think that the sort of Bannonite vision is going, which would be kind of the original MAGA vision, is ultimately going to prevail. And to that extent, I would say there is a kind of taming, because these energies are going to be used in order for again these kind of crises that emerge out of the system that was created coming out of the end of the Cold War, that have just become like internally unsustainable. That these energies are going to be, marshaled in order to allow the kind of world system to, kind of shake out its most, sort of dire threats and crises and achieve some kind of new homeostasis. That's essentially my prediction. And so I suppose that would, be more on the side of a taming than a sort of sense that this is going to actually radically overturn the system. And I do think I think I guess my simplest version of this prediction would be that the sort of Bannonite vision of politics is, and we saw this play out in the H-1B debate, which we discussed last week. I think ultimately that version of politics is largely going to lose, although, it may extract some concessions. And what is more likely to prevail is a weirder and kind of if we think about, I think the figure of Javier Milei is very instructive here, because Javier Milei, ideologically is entirely aligned with the so-called Washington Consensus, of the 1990s through 2010s. There's very little in terms of his kind of doctrinal understanding of how the economic system should work, that differs fundamentally from any of that. I brought up Ireland before. He said that Ireland is the ultimate model nation. I wrote about this in the Substack. So I think he's maybe the emblematic figure of this, right? He has he kind of channels some of these kind of bizarre dark energies, but channels them into the kind of re-inauguration of a new version of this system. So that's, I guess, my ultimate version of, and so maybe it's not quite right to call it taming, because he's not a sort of tame figure. Like his sort of bizarre dark energies are quite fundamental to his political formula. So there's a kind of I suppose there's a taming of right populism, but there's also an untaming of neoliberalism, or whatever we want to call it. That it's actually aligned with these kind of strange trollish figures, whether Millet or Musk, who embody this kind of it's stylistically a deep contrast from the world of the kind of the adults in the room and the very serious people of the European Central Bank or whatever. If we think here of like the confrontation between the confrontation between like Yanis Varoufakis and the Brussels elites 10 years ago, right? The Varoufakis kind of bad boy, leather jacket, motorcycle energy has transferred over to the sort of Millets and Musks and so on of the world. But in a sense, they are ideologically still aligned with the European Central Bank, if that makes sense. So we could see it as a kind of synthesis.
Well, I was just going to say, I was struck by your use of the word weird there, because I was just reading a paper by Christopher Lyon today, and he says it's odd the way that people use weird so much. He's talking about it in a very specific context, but he says that in Old English, weird means having the power to control fate, which I did not know. And I remember reading, when I was sort of deep diving into the whole, like what was going on with COVID, and I was looking at the records of lobbying in the EU. And after some digging, I found I've sort of followed this rabbit hole until I got to this meeting of these bankers in 2019, surveying the state of their affairs and saying, we must accept that 2020 will not be a normal year. In other words, that 2020 will be weird. And I feel like since then we've entered, well, maybe people will say since 2016, but I don't think anyone would argue that since 2020 was the turn of weird, that politics as usual wasn't happening anymore, that we entered the world, or we've seen now from 2016 till 2025, the triumph of weird politics. But it's a politics that indeed attempts to control fate, but not to change anything, but to maintain the status quo. That we can no longer, the consensus seems to be, we can no longer allow business to trundle along as usual. There will need to be some big interventions and some big changes to keep everything the same. And so I think that's kind of what we'll see moving forward, is the continuation of weird politics, not to change anything, but to keep everything the same.
So this is the famous line from the leopard, right? For everything to stay the same, everything must change.
Yeah,
kind of moment.
And there's some echoes of Zizek's violence in there.
Favorite novel. Yeah, I am going to gamely take up the right-wing populism has triumphed argument. If it has triumphed, you can say it. You've seen a change in trade policies initiated by Trump that Biden continued and deepened in certain ways, and you could also say that Trump's rhetoric on immigration has gained increasing acceptance. I mean, during Trump's first term, public opinion actually recoiled against his immigration policies. Now it's moved very far in his favor, including remarkable numbers of Hispanics in the U.S. favoring mass deportations, things like this. So you could point to those two things to kind of declare a triumph of right-wing populism. Now, it should be added that Trump's challenge to neoliberalism was never total or direct. I mean, he's in many ways a free markets, pro-business kind of let a rip guy, but he does on certain issues at least intimate a desire. He suggests a desire for national control or political control of the free movement of capital and goods and people. So we'll see if that is borne out. That optimistic account is borne out in his second term. And I think that just really gets to a few fundamental things that Trump needs to do to be considered a success and to deliver on the promises of really all three of his campaigns. And those things are very simple. One, a good economy. People voted for him for a good economy. Two, a real change in the rate of immigration, really bringing that down. And now probably deporting some number of people, but I think above all, just reducing the numbers. Something that has begun under Biden as he's kind of brought back in an approximation of some of Trump's policies. Three, will he get some of the big changes he's been mooting on tariffs? Will he dial up, his tariff-based trade policy in some way? And then finally, will he avoid these forever wars that he's always talking about? So I think one thing that his desire for a good economy is felt to be in sharp tension with his desired trade policies, and you've seen that tension play out in his cabinet selections. So there are plenty of reasons to wonder whether or not he can actually deliver on all this, whether that's possible. But I think those are really the four things that Trump needs to do. And maybe he can pull off three of them. If he pulls off all four, that will be a huge success. Just whether you like those ideas or not, if they're good or bad, he will have succeeded on the terms he's set out for himself. All these topics really connect. Elon Musk, single-handedly has revived the topic of grooming gangs in the UK. Ashley, you've spent a good amount of time in the UK. Can you just lay out in simple terms this story for people who haven't seen it in the papers over the years for American listeners?
Sure. So a lot of people won't have heard very much about it, maybe even until now, because because it was, I don't know if it was sort of systematically covered up, but there was a lot of reluctance within the UK press to ever report on this. There was a sense that it was too, that even simply reporting on it was racist. And this kind of gets at the heart of exactly what's happened and why this has become such a scandal. So essentially, there were rings, I suppose, or people are saying gangs of gangs that were systematically recruiting and exploiting young girls, mainly working class girls. And it came to light, but not only did it come to light that there, you got girls as young as 12 being raped, um, sometimes, by multiple men. But the fact that it was, when it came to light, it wasn't that it came to light, oh, this happened and the police are investigating. It's that it was reported by the parents, by all sorts of people for years, and police did nothing about it. In one case, a police officer even said to a father of one of the victims, maybe this will teach her a lesson. And it was because of this, everyone was so afraid of racism, and oh, it would be racist, because these were Pakistani men. It would be racist to do anything about this. Everyone's talking about the racism connection, but it was fundamentally why this happened was because of classism, because there was a belief that these working class girls deserved it, that they deserved what they got for hanging out with older boys, this sort of thing. And it was absolutely disgusting. But when it first came to light, in the mid 2010s, nobody would talk about it. Nobody would even, it was like, this is just fodder for the far right. Oh, this is just fodder for the far right. So you couldn't even talk about the fact that young girls were being systematically abused, exploited, and raped because it would be fuel for the far right. And now everybody's talking about it, but for a long time, it was just a few brave people who would stick their necks out and say, like, this was wrong. And they would be accused of racism. And even Starmer tried to do this. He tried to use the same tactic a few days ago when he was talking about it, saying that this is just, something that the far right's cooking up. Really, those young girls who were raped, they're just, what are they, far right? Are they just, their rapes were far right? Is that how this works? So it's, quite rightfully gaining a lot of attention. But it seems to me that people who had long never said a word about it are now kind of dipping their toe into the water. And I won't name names. But I've seen people saying, like, for a long time I didn't say anything about this because I thought it had something to do with the far right, but now I'm realizing this is really disgusting. This is going on for years. The police covered it up on purpose because they were afraid of seeming racist. And it's like, you just admitted that you saw that all these young girls are being raped and exploited, and you didn't say anything because you were afraid of what your left-wing friends would think about you. I mean, that is how low you're willing to stoop to look good on Twitter, really? So this is kind of the state of the scandal. But probably the most contradictory and stupid thing I have seen is the Tate brothers coming out and saying, well, we're going to enter into, I don't know if you saw this, we're going to enter into politics because of this grooming gangs scandal. And one of the victims had the courage to say, wow, that's an incredible irony. And she unfortunately didn't say the word accused. But aren't you accused of doing the exact same thing? You Muslim men grooming young women? Isn't that what you're being accused of? And then they threatened to sue her and made her grovel. And it's enough to make you a feminist.
Well, yeah, certainly, Andrew Tate, as you say, a Muslim convert who is alleged to run some kind of abusive OnlyFans type operation. His shaming and silencing of that woman really shows his commitment to chivalry and decency and the good treatment of the fair sex and all that. Obviously he's incredibly sincere on these things. Yeah, it's very striking to me. Obviously, this scandal, like others, it has political valence. It can be put to different political uses. You've seen obviously that focus on sex abuse in the Catholic Church, something that absolutely did occur over the course of decades, was a scandal to which great attention was drawn in the midst of secularization, right, of Western societies. That's certainly the case. Also, the Me Too movement drawing attention to various forms of sexual harassment in the film industry and other culture industries was part of a broader feminist moment in the culture. So uh, these things do have political valences, but you still have to attend to the facts, look at what the facts are, and be willing to take account of them. It it is it does seem a little rich to me that when people insist on, oh well, this is about painting an entire group with one brush. This is a sex panic. This is this. This is that. When they have gone along with all the other uh, kind of attempts to draw attention to various forms of sexual abuse, harassment, rape, that could be described, similarly. That had certain political purposes that were used to characterize not just specific offenders but whole groups of people. Uh, so it's kind of striking for me to see that reversal. I will admit that I do get a little leery of these narratives. Very often the claims, or at least what people take from them, outstrip the facts. That just happens, and maybe that's inevitable in a kind of mass media society. And it's just a way of reacting to the moral horror of any such violation. Um, but what I hope we see coming out of this renewed attention, coming oddly from Musk, is real attention to the facts and a sober and thorough accounting. And it seems that there's a lot of resistance to giving that accounting.
Yeah, I mean, your comparison to the church is apt because you have to keep in mind this was going on since the 80s. This is going, we're talking about, there's some estimates like up to 1,400 girls were abused. Like there's tons, it's not like a few girls. It's like systematic and going on for a long period of time. And like social workers have now, well, not now. I mean, the first convictions were, I think, 15 years ago or something like that. And there was, the Times was covering it. But very few people, very few outlets were willing to go all in like that. And social workers were seeing girls getting picked up all hours of the night. They weren't really doing anything about it. Or like the care workers or people working in children's homes. So it was going on for such a long time, and the overarching view until like very, very recently was these girls deserved it. And somebody like Tate probably believes that himself until it became politically opportune for him to say something about it, and pretend like he cares. But I don't, and nobody cared about those girls because nobody cares about working class girls generally. Until, of course, you can get a political opportunity out of it.
Yeah, and I will say I'm, convinced by the observation that many have made that this seemed to be this particular wave of outrage seemed to be kind of ginned up by Musk to shift the conversation away from the H-1B visa debate, which had sort of introduced the first really significant fracture within the coalition, along the terms I was laying out previously. And so, yeah, there's something very kind of weird and postmodern, just a real kind of illustration of postmodern politics that, you just kind of dip into the archive of, sort of culture war type conflicts, and you can just kind of, if you have and it does speak to the significance of his ownership of the platform, that essentially he can use it to drive the conversation in a particular direction. And I have to be like pretty cynical about, and this, for this reason, I'm not particularly convinced that this will lead to anything very substantial, because it did seem just like kind of a diversion from something else that actually did potentially kind of threaten the political project he's attempting to undertake in Mar-a-Lago at the moment. And so it felt, just kind of ugly and cynical to me on that level, at least.
I mean, it's Maloney all over again. It's like, okay, I'm going to do what my EU handlers want me to do economically, but before anybody gets mad, what about those lesbian moms? You know, you got to press that button, press the culture war button, and everybody forgot. Oh, just like that, you're on our side again.
And with that, thanks, Ashley. Thank you, Jeff. And thanks to our producer, Stephen Adebato. For more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.